I think, Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned. I've heard that comment. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, for example, I counted up in your book, We Who Wrestle with God, the number of references to Cain. Mm-hmm. There are 356 references to Cain in the book, and 20 references to the descendants of Cain. You're obsessed with Cain because Cain is symbolic of evil. All the evil in the world, you more or less blame Cain for. And this is Cain. I mean, you don't believe Cain actually existed, I presume.
Well, I think of Cain as, well,
do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. And so
yes,
it's a higher
different.
level of existence.
That's different. I realize that.
Well, there are Cain types who exist, and they're
there are Cain types. But Cain himself, I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't. What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said, I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
What's a different matter? A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
Well, I can imagine a situation where when the story was originated, that it referred to two actual brothers. But as the stories propagate across time, as they mutate, as they adapt, let's say, to the structure of human memory, they deepen and they become broader. And so then they become emblematic not only of the pattern of conflict that might characterize the original two brothers that the story was about, but about the conflict between brothers as such, and then the more fundamental levels of conflict that exist within human beings, which is what you see in more sophisticated literature. It's like the biblical accounts speak of fact in a factual manner upon occasion, but the biblical accounts also speak poetically and metaphorically and allegorically, and people who are sophisticated in biblical analysis have known this for centuries. The biblical literalists generally suffer from the problem that they don't even know what it means to be literalist. There's lots of unsophisticated ways of approaching a text.
Okay, let's see what Professor Dawkins thinks about that.
Well, I suppose I'm a literalist. I mean, and you give the game away when you say Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in a natural way.
Well, I'm speaking allegorically there within the confines of the text. I mean, what I meant by that was that the way the story lays itself out is that Adam and Eve are created by God. And so they're not emblematic of the pattern of human beings that exist in fallen history. Within the confines of the text, the first two people who are genuine, who aren't creations of the divine, are Cain and Abel. And so for me, they're emblematic of the patterns of conflict that rip people apart in the world of history, in the world of normal history.
Professor Dawkins, I know you take particular umbrage with that statement that Cain and Abel were the first normally born human beings, but I think if I understand Dr. Peterson correctly, there are things that can be sort of true within a story. It's true that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street, and as far as I understand, that's maybe what you mean by the truth in the matter of Cain and Abel being the first naturally born humans. It's internal to the story. Well, in the context
of this story, they're the first two spirits or patterns you could think of, patterns of perception and action, that characterize human existence in the fallen world, right? So they're emblematic of what happens in history outside of the whatever is meant by the pre-existent paradise.
But at the same time, you must know, I know this comes up all of the time when somebody says, but did Cain and Abel really exist? And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment. Like it's not a trivial question, because you can answer yes, and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov. But it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. And so Raskolnikov is hyper-real, not real.
But to be clear, is that how you feel about Cain and Abel? That is to say, an identifiable
hyper-real
Homo sapiens called Cain,
it's irrelevant.
who murders his brother.
In a sense, it's irrelevant to me because even if they were real, like, we don't know anything about them as historical figures.
Of course, even if they weren't real, of course they weren't real.
Well, like I said, it could have been the case that when the story originated, way back when it originated, that the first people that were described by the first person who generated the seeds of the Cain and Abel story were referring to actual people. But it doesn't matter because the text is being compressed and modified over a vast span of time. And it's accreted all sorts of meanings that certainly weren't part and parcel of whatever the original story was.
Let's take the point Alex was making. Within the confines of the story, Dostoevsky was a great writer. What makes you think the writers of Genesis were a great writer? I mean, who were they? We know nothing about them.
Well, I think they were great writers because I think I understand the patterning of the stories and what it points to. I think the idea, for example, that Cain and Abel are emblematic of two opposed patterns of adaptation to the world is brilliant. It's almost brilliant beyond imagining, especially because the story is so insanely compressed. And it's certainly evident to me as a clinician that the patterns that are portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel play themselves out in the real world continually and terribly, terribly.
You think the author of that story in Genesis was a literary genius?
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth. How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time. It's lost in history.
So the story evolved. You're saying it's the story
like a meme.
Yes, well, that's interesting.
It evolved to match the contours of the human memory. That's exactly it, is that these stories, that's part of their archetypal nature. Like, so they have a emotional and motivational expression, but as they propagate across time, they also evolve so they're maximally memorable. And they're maximally memorable for a biological reason.
Well, that's very interesting. If they really did evolve over time, if you could actually trace successive manuscripts, you can't do that. I mean, there's presumably a couple of Hebrew manuscripts and a Greek one. And I mean, what do you mean when you say it evolved?
Well, I would say you can see that in the compilation of the biblical texts, because one of the things that you see evolve, and you criticized the biblical text at one point. Correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't want to get this wrong. You said that there isn't anything in the biblical text that constitutes, let's say, significant original discovery, which is something that you'd expect if it was of divine providence, let's say, divine provenance. And so, I think, I was thinking about that objection, and I think that one of the discoveries that the text lays bare in an insanely brilliant manner is that the foundation of the community is sacrifice, that's an appropriate conceptualization. And you can see the concept of sacrifice evolve across the biblical texts as they're sequenced chronologically in the overall story that makes up the biblical text. The idea of sacrifice becomes more and more sophisticated. It's more and more elaborated. It's more and more specified. It's more and more embodied. There's an obvious progression in ideas.
The progression, where do you see that progression? In successive manuscripts? Or
in the successive stories as the text progresses. The way a novel progresses.
So something like sacrifice in the Old Testament. Sacrifice in the Old Testament.
No, through the
way through to the New Testament.
Text is a sacrificial story as well. The Passion story is a story of sacrifice.
It is
and
indeed.
The sacrificial motif recurs continually through the biblical text, and it's elaborated constantly.
Okay, so the criticism is the Bible as a text gives us nothing to indicate that it has divine origin. There's nothing that we can read in it where we think there's no way this idea could have evolved were it not divinely put into this text. That's a criticism that perhaps Professor Dawkins made in the past.
Well, I think it's reflective of some order that's so profound and implicit that there isn't a better way of describing it than divine. But I don't really care if we look at that from the bottom up, like as a biological phenomena, or as from the top down. I don't think it makes any difference.
It doesn't make a difference whether it was divinely inspired or whether it evolved within human.
I don't think look, so let me ask you this. Like, I think that at bottom, truth is unified. And what that's going to mean eventually is that the world of value and the world of fact coincide in some manner that we don't yet understand. And I think that union, the fact of that union, and the fact of that union is equivalent to what's being described as divine order across millennia. There's no difference. Now, and this is a tricky business, because you either believe that the world of truth is unified in the final analysis, or you don't. Those are the options. And if it's not unified, then there's a disunity. There's a contradiction between value and fact, or there's a contradiction between different sets of values, and they can't be brought into a unity. I don't believe that.
Well, let's go back to what you said earlier, which I was very interested in. You implied there's no difference between whether the text is divinely inspired or whether it evolved in progression during a series of manuscripts, presumably. Now, I think that's genuinely interesting, but it's a huge difference. It's not the same thing. I mean, either it was divinely inspired or it wasn't.
Well, it's the same thing if it's fundamentally reflective of and accurately reflective of the implicit logos or order. And I think it is. Like, let me explain that a moment. Like, it took me a long time to understand the concept of sacrifice in the biblical text, because it seems so anachronistic and so primitive, and not understandable. What are these people doing, offering, choice cuts of meat to a God that lives in the sky?
Something disgusting about it.
Well, it's very easy to satirize. But when you start to understand that perception itself is sacrificial in its nature, and you start to understand that there's no difference between work and sacrifice, that they're the same thing, and you understand that community is predicated on sacrifice, then the emphasis in the text on sacrifice starts to become something quite marked and remarkable, especially because it's implicit. It isn't obvious at all that the authors of the texts and the editors who sequenced them actually understood what it was that they were highlighting. So with regards to the community, why is the community predicated on sacrifice? Because it's not about you, the community. Every step you take towards the communitarian means that you sacrifice something that's local to what you want here and now, right now.
I think
you have to give something up.
You're wandering onto something else now, which is something quite different. The notion of sacrifice, as you say, it goes right through the Old Testament and the New Testament. The sacrifice of Isaac or Ishmael by Abraham and the sacrifice of Jesus is the same idea. I think it's a very unpleasant idea, by the way. But what are you actually saying? Are you saying that Abraham did or did not sacrifice Isaac? Are you saying that Jesus really did die for our sins? I mean, do you believe that? Do you believe that as a fact, that Jesus died for our sins?
There are elements of the texts that I don't claim to understand. What my experience has been that the more deeply I look into these texts, the more I learned. That doesn't mean that I can proclaim full knowledge of what the texts proclaim. But I don't think, and I'm not trying to play a trick here. I watched an interview that you did recently where you were talking, I think it was with Piers Morgan, about the complexities of trying to understand this strange realm of quantum phenomena, right? And we have a trouble with quantum phenomena because at the micro level, things don't act like things act at the macro level. So they escape our intuitions. And one of the things you said was that although it's perhaps even impossible for creatures embodied like us to get a grip on quantum phenomena, the strange wave-particle duality, for example, we have ample evidence that it works, and stellarly. And I would say exactly the same thing about the biblical texts.
Oh.
If they run into a mystery, like there's a horizon of mystery, which I do not claim to penetrate, but insofar as I've been able to understand the texts, every time I make a improvement in understanding, it reveals something to me that's just like shattering.
Quantum physics is deeply mysterious, and you're saying that biblical texts are deeply mysterious. The difference is quantum physics, the predictions you derive from quantum physics are fulfilled to the umpteenth decimal place. The umpteenth decimal place, I mean, I think it was Richard Feynman says, equivalent to predicting the width of North America to the nearest hair's breadth. Now,
right.
that's impressive. That's
no doubt.
The mystery there, as it were, gains its credentials by its predictions. The mysteries of the Bible don't have any credentials at all, as far as I can make out.